Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that might make you rethink your own bedtime routine. Why Viking kings used to sleep in separate beds. Imagine this, you're a mighty Viking king, decked out in armour, with warriors swarming your halls ready to fight and conquer. But when night falls, it's time for your royal rest. And here's the kicker, you sleep in a bed that's all your own, completely separate from everyone else. Not just your warriors, but even your queen. Sounds strange, doesn't it? A royal sleeping arrangement that's as foreign to us today as, well, a Viking raid. Now, before you get too comfortable thinking, this is a medieval sleepover where the king had his own special corner. Take a moment to think about how different things were back then. You probably won't survive this living like a Viking king in the heart of their world, of conquest and mythology. The Vikings weren't just about battles and raids. They had a whole system behind their royal status, and their sleep habits played a surprisingly key role in it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In Viking society, a king wasn't just a leader, he was a larger-than-life figure. But even beyond their formidable strength and bold ambitions, Viking kings were individuals who commanded extraordinary power in a world where might ruled all. They were the ultimate protectors of their people, often seen as having a divine connection to the gods. It's no surprise, then, that their sleeping arrangements were just as carefully curated as their wardrobes or battle plans. But let's back up a bit. Why exactly did Viking kings sleep in separate beds? In a world where most people slept in close quarters with family or comrades, what made the Viking king's bed such a sacred and solitary space? Historians still debate whether this practice was meant to show the king's elevated status or whether it was more practical. After all, Vikings lived in constant danger. But what we do know is this, the Viking king's bed was not just about sleep. It was a matter of power, health, and maintaining a sense of control. In Viking culture, sleep wasn't just a break from the grind of the day, it was a state of mind, almost like a ritual. The act of sleeping alone, especially for a king, was linked to their role as the ultimate protector and leader. It wasn't just about luxury, but about strategy, about making sure the king was well rested, healthy, and prepared for the demands of leading a warrior society. The king's separate bed signified peace and order, both for his body and his mind. But it also allowed space for reflection, an element that was vital for the Viking kings, who believed their connection to the gods was strongest when they had time to rest and think. This was a time of stillness where the warrior leader could prepare for the challenges of the day to come, both physically and spiritually. As you stand in the shadow of a Viking king's grand hall, imagine the sheer scale of his life. From the moment he wakes to the moment he sleeps, every aspect of his day was governed by a strict set of rules, rituals and expectations, especially when it came to his sleep. Viking kings weren't just leaders in battle, they were seen as divinely appointed figures, the earthly representatives of the gods. Their lives were as much about spiritual power as they were about worldly conquest. So the way they rested, the way they slept had to reflect that divine stature. But here's where it gets interesting. The king's bed wasn't just a luxurious place to rest his head after a long day. No, the bed was the throne of the night. It symbolised his authority, his sacred duty, and yes, his personal space. Even the queen who shared a bond with him, unlike anyone else, couldn't share that space. Sleeping in a separate bed wasn't just about having a good night's rest, it was about holding on to the autonomy that came with being king. He was alone in that bed, not because he had no one to share it with, but because he was a man apart from others. So before you get comfortable imagining a Viking king lounging in a fluffy king-sized mattress like a modern-day celebrity, let's dig into the reality of Viking royalty. Their beds were far from the plush comforts we picture today. The king's bed, like the king himself, was functional, rough-hewn, and designed with purpose. It wasn't a soft retreat, it was a place for a king to find clarity and control. These beds weren't made of fine silks or feathers, but rather sturdy wood and animal furs designed to keep the king physically strong and capable of facing the relentless challenges of his role. Historians still argue whether this sleeping arrangement was a necessity or simply a symbol of the king's divine right. Some claim that it was more about practicality. Kings needed rest after all, and they couldn't afford to be disturbed. Others insist it was about asserting authority. When you rule over warriors, your personal space is sacred, a symbol of the boundaries that you, as king, uphold. The king's separate bed wasn't just a space to sleep, it was a declaration of his control, his separation from the mundane world of commoners. It was his throne, his sanctuary. Now imagine the scene. The Viking king walks toward his bed after a long day of leading his warriors into battle. His body is tired, but his mind is sharp. He's not crawling into a soft cushioned bed. Instead, he sits on a firm wooden frame surrounded by furs and thick blankets, ready for a night of uninterrupted rest. In this quiet stillness, the kingdom is safe, his warriors on guard, the people protected, and the king's role as divine protector solidified. It's a moment of peace, a rare chance for him to reset, to let go of the day's burdens. You might be thinking, but what about the queen? Surely she shared the bed with the king, right? Well, not exactly. While the Viking kings had powerful allies in their wives, their relationship with their queens wasn't like that of modern-day royals. The separation of the king's bed wasn't just a matter of personal space. It was part of a larger, carefully designed social order. The role of the queen was sacred in her own right, but the physical separation between her and the king reflected not only his divine power, but the duties they each held in society. It might seem strange to us now. Today, a king and queen share everything, including their sleeping quarters, as symbols of their unity and mutual support. But for Viking kings, the division of their space was symbolic of the hierarchy and the responsibilities of their roles. The queen had her own bed and chamber, separate from the king's, but it was never about lack of affection or unity. It was a matter of spiritual and practical importance. The separation ensured that the king could preserve his energy for leadership, while the queen continued to manage her own realm and responsibilities. Think of it like a business partnership, two powerful individuals maintaining their own space to be at their best, and each playing their role in the larger kingdom. Now imagine walking through the Viking king's chambers. It's not a grand opulent room filled with fine golden treasures. No, it's something much more utilitarian. The furniture is simple but sturdy. His bed, raised on a wooden frame, is covered with thick furs and hides. The walls are lined with tapestries depicting legendary battles and gods, reinforcing the king's status as a divine protector. The king's bed is not for luxury. It's a reminder of the king's connection to the divine realm, where he finds rest only to prepare for his next day of leadership and conquest. The concept of separate beds might seem like a foreign, even uncomfortable idea to many of us today. In a world where we are constantly connected, where privacy is scarce and shared spaces are the norm, the Viking king's bed was a statement. It wasn't just about separation, it was about maintaining the physical, mental, and spiritual boundaries that allowed the king to thrive. This wasn't just about a king's need for a good night's sleep, it was about the need for a space that allowed him to keep his mind focused and his role sacred. Historians continue to debate whether the king's bed was an entirely practical necessity, or whether it was more about the symbolism of the king's role. Some suggest that the separation was critical to the king's need for uninterrupted rest and solitude. Others argue that it was a deliberate act of asserting power, as a reminder that the king, even when in the company of his queen, remained apart from the common world. Either way, this practice, so unique to the Viking world, reflected the larger cultural values of the time, values centered around power, duty, and devotion. But the king's bed was not just a place for rest, it was a stage for rituals that were meant to enhance the king's connection to the divine. The process of retiring to the king's bed involved certain ceremonies, some of which were specific to Viking kingship. These rituals, often overlooked, were deeply tied to the king's spiritual health. After all, sleep wasn't just sleep in the Viking world, it was a form of communion, a time to reconnect with the gods, and a space where the king could refresh his soul for the challenges that lay ahead. Now let's think about the significance of the Viking king's bed in relation to his warriors and his kingdom. It wasn't just the king's own well-being that mattered in this arrangement, it was a matter of ensuring the continued strength of his rule. In a world constantly threatened by raids, power struggles, and the whims of nature, the king's bed was a place where he could rejuvenate for the next day of battle. His rest was seen as an investment in the health of his warriors and his people. After all, a tired king couldn't lead his army effectively. So the practice of sleeping in separate quarters was as much about strategy as it was about the king's personal needs. Think about the countless battles, raids and wars the Viking kings led. They didn't have the luxury of simply clocking out at the end of the day. Their leadership required them to be sharp alert and able to make critical decisions under pressure. The king's separate bed was a space that helped him recharge and refocus. Without the distraction of family life or the noise of the kingdom, the king could retreat into a peaceful solitude, allowing him to confront the challenges of leadership with clarity. In this way, his bed became a fortress of sorts, a place of renewal where he could prepare mentally and physically for his next day as a warrior king. The symbolism behind the king's separate bed also reflects the Viking worldview. In Viking culture, everything had a deeper, often divine meaning. Even the most mundane acts like sleeping were imbued with spiritual significance. The separation of the king's bed was not just a physical space, it was a spiritual boundary that marked him as distinct from the rest of society. This was a reminder that the king was not just a ruler, but a figure connected to the divine, appointed to lead not just with force, but with wisdom and foresight. In a world where the gods were constantly watching, it made sense for the king's bed to serve as a reminder of his sacred duty to the land and the people. Historians continue to debate whether this separation was purely about the king's physical health and well-being, or whether it was a more symbolic practice. Some suggest that the physical act of separating the king from the rest of the household was a form of spiritual discipline, a practice meant to reinforce the sacredness of his role. Others argue that the practice was more practical, an effort to preserve the king's focus and energy for the task at hand. Either way, the importance of the king's bed cannot be underestimated. It was a place where the king could retreat from the pressures of leadership and return to a space that was his alone, a space where he could restore himself for the future of his kingdom. This was a time when kings were expected to lead by example, not only in battle, but in their ability to maintain control over their environment. The king's bed, the ritual of his separate sleep, was a physical representation of this. It marked him as a person, someone who bore the weight of the kingdom and the God's will. While it may seem strange to us today, the separation of the king's bed was essential in a society where authority was divinely ordained, and the king's every action needed to reflect that. At the same time, it wasn't just about isolation. The king's bed allowed for moments of quiet reflection and a time to reconnect with the gods. Viking kings were often seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people, and sleep was seen as a form of spiritual communion. During these solitary moments in bed, the king could speak to the gods through his dreams, a practice that made sleep sacred, not just necessary. The king's separate bed was a space where he could connect with divine forces, ensuring that his leadership remained blessed and secure. As we move deeper into the realm of Viking kingship, it's clear that the separate bed was not an isolated tradition. It was part of a larger cultural landscape where the Vikings placed immense importance on personal boundaries, not just for the protection of the king, but also as a means of maintaining societal order. The king's separation during sleep reflected the structure of the entire Viking world, where each person had a specific role to play. This structure wasn't just about ruling, it was about respect for the divine order, something deeply ingrained in the Viking worldview. Consider how the Vikings viewed the world. Everything had a purpose, whether it was a battle, a feast, or even a moment of solitude. For the king, his bed was not just for rest, it was a place to reinforce his sacred role as a ruler chosen by the gods. And because of the importance of his sleep, the bed was treated with respect, even reverence. This wasn't a place for indulgence or comfort in the modern sense. No, the king's bed was practical and simple, but every aspect of it served to remind him of his duty. Historians have long debated whether this division was a spiritual necessity or a pragmatic choice. Some believe that the king's separate sleep was purely a matter of strategy. After all, a well-rested king is a more effective leader. Others see it as a divine mandate, a part of the larger narrative of Viking kingship that intertwined politics, religion, and even the realm of dreams. Regardless of the reason, the division was sacred. It wasn't about isolation, it was about making space for clarity, focus, and the ability to lead effectively. The practice of separate beds also reflects the role of Vikings as master strategists. The king's role wasn't just as a figurehead, he was actively involved in leading raids, making strategic alliances, and shaping the future of his people. In this light, the bed became more than just a place of sleep, it was a tool for leadership. A well-rested king was a more capable strategist, someone who could make better decisions in times of war and peace. The concept of separate wasn't just for spiritual reasons, but for mental clarity, a time where the king could prepare for the challenges ahead. Now imagine how this would have affected Viking society. A king who had a space for solitary rest and reflection would naturally bring a sense of stability to the kingdom. This solitude was not isolation for the sake of loneliness, it was a reflection of the king's role as both a spiritual leader and a warrior. His separation from the rest of the household gave him the mental space he needed to protect and lead. It was a practical and necessary step to ensure the kingdom's survival. His mental well-being directly impacted the success of his leadership. But not all Viking kings followed the same sleeping customs. Depending on their region, status, or personal preferences, kings might have different arrangements. Some scholars argue that the strictness of the separate bed practice could vary, with certain kings preferring to have more interaction with their families. However, the essential idea remains: the king's sleep was a private, sacred time for reflection, and this separation reinforced his ability to lead effectively. This custom also worked in tandem with the broader Viking social structure, where the king's leadership was seen as divinely ordained. The act of separating oneself from the rest of the household mirrored the king's divine appointment. He was a person set apart not only by birth but by divine right. His sleep, like his rule, needed to be uninterrupted and filled with purpose. The king's separate bed wasn't simply an oddity of the past, it was a foundational aspect of how the Vikings understood leadership and the divine order. Even as Vikings expanded their reach, conquering new lands and kingdoms, they adhered to the spiritual and practical significance of such customs. The separate bed wasn't just an artifact of medieval life, it was a reflection of how deeply the Viking world was entwined with their understanding of power, divinity, and authority. Let's take a closer look at how the Viking king's separate bed fits into the broader context of Viking warfare and leadership. In Viking society, the king wasn't just a ruler in the traditional sense. He was expected to be a warrior, a strategist, and importantly a leader on the battlefield. His strength and resilience were measured not just by the territory he controlled, but by his ability to lead his men into battle and make difficult decisions under pressure. A king who was well rested, mentally clear, and physically prepared was far more likely to lead his warriors to victory. This brings us to the significance of the separate bed. The bed, as we've seen, wasn't just a place for sleep. It was a space where the king could retreat from the chaotic demands of leadership and find peace. But peace wasn't just a luxury, it was a tool. It allowed the king to recover from the exhausting mental and physical toll of leadership. Imagine the king preparing for an impending battle. He could spend a day strategizing, meeting with warriors, and commanding his forces. But once the day ended, he needed the solitude of his separate bed to reflect, recharge, and prepare for the challenges ahead. It was during these quiet moments that the Viking king could commune with the gods, mentally rehearse battle plans, and mentally prepare for the pressure of leadership. While the rest of the kingdom slept, the king's mind was at work thinking of the kingdom's survival, his warriors, and the future of his people. The separate bed was in this sense essential. It provided him with the necessary space to align his thoughts, seek divine guidance, and prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. The king's physical separation wasn't just about protecting his privacy, it was about creating an environment that fostered clear, focused thinking. Think about it. The Viking king was often the centre of everything. He was expected to be a symbol of authority and a pillar of strength both physically and mentally. His leadership was tied to his ability to stay sharp, to think on his feet, and to make decisions that would affect the lives of many. The separate bed created a sanctuary for him, allowing him to be at his best for the kingdom, ensuring that the weight of his decisions didn't wear him down. Now imagine a more typical day in the life of a Viking king. As dawn breaks, the king wakes early, possibly before anyone else in the household. He rises from his bed and begins his day of intense planning, communicating with his generals, and overseeing the kingdom's affairs. But the time he spends in his bed apart from the world is just as important. That brief moment of solitude at night allows him to mentally organise his day, reflect on the success or failure of his strategies, and ensure that he is well prepared for whatever may come. His sleep may have been solitary, but it served a far larger purpose. It kept him at the peak of his capabilities. Historians often debate whether the separate sleeping arrangements were purely a personal preference or if they were grounded in the cultural practices of the time. Some argue that the division of the king's bed was more than just about practicality. It was a manifestation of the king's role as a God-ordained figure, someone who needed to maintain his purity and strength. Others suggest that it was simply a matter of the king needing uninterrupted rest free from the distractions of family or court life. Regardless of the reasoning, it's clear that this tradition had a practical impact on the king's ability to rule effectively and maintain his focus. Moreover, the king's separate bed was not just about the night time. It influenced how the king carried himself throughout the day. It reinforced the idea that the king was not like other men. He was above the fray, a leader not just in battle, but in every aspect of life. The separation of his sleeping quarters was a constant reminder of his role as a supreme authority, someone who was mentally, physically, and spiritually distinct from the rest of his people. In this way, the Viking king's bed was a fundamental part of his identity, an identity rooted in leadership, divine appointment, and the weight of the kingdom. In Viking society, everything had a purpose, even the way the king slept. The separate bed wasn't just a comfort or luxury, it was a deliberate, calculated aspect of his leadership. It was about maintaining the physical, mental, and spiritual clarity needed to guide the kingdom. The king's bed, though humble in its design, played a crucial role in shaping the king's ability to lead effectively. It ensured that he remained sharp, focused, and capable of handling the immense responsibility that came with his title. As the Viking kings continued their reigns, the influence of their separate sleeping arrangements extended beyond the royal chambers and into the daily life of their warriors and subjects. The king's separation during sleep wasn't just a reflection of his power, it had real implications for how the kingdom functioned. The Viking king's leadership was rooted in strength, and every decision, every action was meant to ensure the survival and prosperity of the kingdom. But this leadership didn't come easily. It required constant vigilance, both physically and mentally. When we think about the power dynamics of Viking society, it's clear that the king's position wasn't one of leisure. It was a constant balancing act between war diplomacy and survival. And while the idea of sleeping separately might sound a bit eccentric today, for the Viking kings it made perfect sense. Their kingdoms were constantly in flux, constantly under threat from neighbouring tribes, raiders, and even their own internal conflicts. In such an environment, the king's need for uninterrupted sleep wasn't just about rest, it was about maintaining his edge, his ability to think clearly and to lead his people in the right direction. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The king's separate bed also served as a demonstration of his status. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was an emblem of his power. While other warriors and leaders might share sleeping quarters, the king's solitary bed reinforced his divine and earthly role. In a society where strength was worshipped, his ability to separate himself from the day's distractions and find peace in solitude was a mark of the king's resilience. This practice reflected the larger Viking belief in personal responsibility and individual strength. The king's separate bed wasn't just a space for rest, it was a symbol of self-mastery, an embodiment of the warrior ethos that defined the Viking world. Historians still debate whether the separate bed was entirely about practicality or whether it served a symbolic function as well. Some argue that it was a practical necessity, enabling the king to rest without the distractions of a busy court. Others insist that it was a tool to reinforce the king's elevated status, signalling to the entire kingdom that the king was not just a man, but an almost divine figure, worthy of respect and reverence. What is clear, however, is that this practice played a significant role in reinforcing the structure of Viking society, where the king was seen not just as a leader, but as a living embodiment of the gods themselves. The relationship between the king and his warriors was also reflected in this practice. Viking warriors were by their nature a fierce and loyal group. They understood the demands of battle, the need for discipline, and the importance of rest. By keeping their king separate from them during the night, they were reinforcing the idea that the king was above them, not in a way that diminished their loyalty, but in a way that reflected the hierarchy necessary for maintaining order. The king was the centre of the kingdom, but the warriors were its backbone. The king's bed was a physical representation of this separation between the ruler and the ruled, between the divine figurehead and the earthly warriors who served him. This separation extended beyond the physical realm. The Viking kings were in a sense connected to the gods through their leadership, and their sleeping arrangements symbolized this divine connection. The act of sleeping in solitude allowed the king to prepare spiritually for his role. Whether or not he consciously recognized it, each night in his bed was an opportunity to refresh his mind, body, and spirit, ensuring that he could continue to lead his kingdom with divine wisdom. This is a theme that runs throughout Viking culture, the connection between physical well-being and spiritual strength. The Vikings saw no separation between body and soul. Every act from battle to rest was viewed through the lens of spiritual purpose. At the end of the day, the king's separate bed was more than just a practical necessity. It was a tool for maintaining power, a ritual that reinforced the king's role as both leader and spiritual guide. In the harsh and unforgiving world of the Vikings, sleep was not just a necessity, it was a strategic act. It was a time for the king to recharge, to reconnect with his divine purpose, and to prepare for the challenges ahead. Whether it was a matter of health, authority, or spirituality, the separate bed had a profound impact on the king's ability to lead. As we continue to reflect on the lives of the Viking kings, it becomes clear that their separate beds were more than just a quirky custom. They were a cornerstone of the way the Vikings understood leadership power and the connection between the divine and the earthly. The practice of sleeping alone wasn't just about solitude, it was about the king's role in shaping the future of his kingdom and ensuring that his mind, body, and spirit were always prepared for the next challenge. In addition to the king's private bed, the Viking world was rich with rituals that complemented the king's solitary sleep. These rituals didn't just exist in the realms of spiritual significance, they were woven into the very fabric of Viking daily life. For the king, sleep wasn't just a retreat from the world, it was an extension of his leadership. This was especially true given the Viking belief that the king's power came not just from physical strength, but from his connection to the gods and the divine. This connection was often nurtured through rituals, many of which took place right before the king retired to his separate bed. Imagine for a moment that the Viking king is preparing for sleep. After a long, grueling day filled with decisions, the tensions of leadership, and perhaps even battle, he steps into his private quarters. But before climbing into his bed, he engages in a series of rituals. These rituals weren't elaborate in the way we might think of a royal ceremony today. Instead, they were simple, profound acts that centered on the king's relationship with the gods and his own inner strength. One such ritual involved offerings to the gods before retiring for the night. A small wooden table might hold simple tokens, a handful of herbs perhaps, or a small bowl of water offered in gratitude or as a plea for divine favour. The king's personal space was sacred, and the ritual before sleep reinforced his connection to the divine. Historians still argue whether these rituals were considered an essential part of the king's role, or whether they were simply part of a larger Viking tradition of invoking the gods in all aspects of life. Some suggest that the rituals were an important spiritual practice helping the king maintain divine favour and strength. Others argue that they were more symbolic, reinforcing the king's role as a leader who bridged the gap between the gods and the people. Either way, it's clear that the rituals surrounding sleep were a fundamental part of the Viking king's life. The king's sleep was thus surrounded by a veil of spiritual importance. It wasn't just about laying down to rest, it was about stepping into a space where divine protection was sought and where the king could prepare mentally for the challenges of the next day. Sleep became more than just a way to recover. It was a spiritual practice that reinforced the king's ability to lead, and perhaps his ability to dream of victory, success, and prosperity for his people. In the quiet solitude of his bed, the Viking king was not just a ruler, he was a servant of the gods. His rest wasn't a luxury, it was a sacred duty. And it was during these quiet moments of sleep that the king could recharge his mental and spiritual energy to be ready for the battles that awaited him the next day. It's no wonder that sleep in Viking culture was so carefully regulated and revered. But the king wasn't the only one affected by these customs. The warriors and people who served him were also part of the larger framework that supported this system. The king's personal rituals, his separate bed, and his clear need for space and reflection were all seen as vital to maintaining the strength of the kingdom. When a king slept well, when he was at peace and rested, the entire kingdom benefited. A well-rested king meant a strong, clear-headed leader for the people, someone who could guide them through the trials of life, whether in battle or peace. It's fascinating to think about how this all fit together. The rituals of sleep weren't just about personal restoration, they were about reinforcing the king's sacred role as protector, leader, and divine representative. The king's well-being was the well-being of the kingdom and the space he carved out for rest, for spiritual communion, and for preparation became central to his ability to rule. Historians still argue whether Viking kings were deeply influenced by religious rituals in their daily lives, or if these practices were rooted in practical necessity. Some believe that these rituals were more spiritual, reflecting the king's deep connection to the gods. Others argue that they were pragmatic. A king who rested well would be more effective in battle and leadership. Regardless of the reason, it's clear that these rituals were a reflection of the Viking king's role, one that combined leadership with spirituality, power with reverence. Now, stepping back and reflecting on the cultural significance of the king's separate bed, we see that this practice was not just a personal preference, it was a reflection of the greater Viking societal structure. The Viking way of life was built on respect for order and hierarchy, where each person had their designated role, and each role came with expectations and responsibilities. The king's separation from others during sleep was a powerful symbol of his distinct role, not just within his household, but within the entire Viking community. It was a physical manifestation of the hierarchy that defined the Vikings' warriors, kings and gods, each with their own defined space and authority. This strict separation between the king and others was also an extension of the Viking concept of personal responsibility. The king's separate bed was a space that allowed him to regain his energy, both mentally and physically, ensuring that he was always at his best to perform his duties. He wasn't just a ruler for his kingdom, he was a representative of the divine, a figurehead who embodied the hopes, strength and survival of his people. In a world constantly under threat, the king's health focus and clarity were of utmost importance. This practice of sleeping separately wasn't merely about luxury. It was a practical step taken to ensure the king could always be ready to protect his kingdom. Yet beyond the practicality of rest, this custom also served a more profound spiritual purpose. The separation of the king during sleep was a daily act of humility, an acknowledgement of his role as a servant of the gods. He was not just a man of flesh and blood, he was a conduit between the divine and the earthly realm. His bed was a sacred space, a temporary sanctuary where he could restore his body and soul before he went out again to face the harsh demands of leadership and battle. Sleep for the Viking king was never just sleep, it was a ritual in and of itself. But let's be clear, this wasn't about the king isolating himself from the rest of society in an aloof or distant way. Rather, the king's separate bed represented his unique role in Viking society. It wasn't a rejection of connection, it was a way of ensuring the king could be at his best when it truly mattered. The people who served him, from warriors to advisors, understood this, and they accepted that the king's rest was a part of the larger cultural understanding that allowed for stability and strength. Imagine yourself now walking into the quiet hall where the king sleeps. You see the stone walls, the wooden furnishings, and the flickering light of torches casting long shadows on the floor. At the far end of the room is the king's bed, raised on a sturdy wooden frame, covered in furs. It's simple, functional, but there's a sense of peace in the space. The king in his solitude is preparing himself spiritually and mentally. He is alone with his thoughts, his duties, and his connection to the divine. And in that space he is restored, renewed, and ready for the challenges that lie ahead. This is a king who understands that leadership comes with great responsibility, and that responsibility extends to his personal well-being. For the Vikings, the health of the king was not just a personal matter, it was a matter of the kingdom's survival. The separation of the king during sleep was a ritual that ensured the leader was in the best possible state to guide his people through their turbulent world. It was a tradition that underscored the very essence of Viking kingship, where personal duty, divine responsibility, and practical necessity all converged. Historians still argue over how much of this practice was driven by spirituality versus practical need. Some scholars believe the rituals around sleep were deeply religious, a reflection of the king's sacred duty to protect and lead. Others argue that the practice was more pragmatic. A tired king is a less effective king, and the separation of his sleeping quarters was simply an attempt to ensure he was always rested and at his peak. Either way, the practice has left a lasting mark on the Viking legacy, reminding us of the delicate balance between duty, spirituality, and the demands of leadership. As we move forward in understanding the Viking king's role, we must examine the broader implications of this separation in relation to Viking culture. For the Viking kings, their sleep wasn't just about rest, it was about preserving their authority, physical well-being, and spiritual connection. But in Viking society, where the demands of leadership were constant, every aspect of the king's life, from his waking moments to his sleep, played a critical role in maintaining order, power, and control. The separate bed wasn't just a personal choice, it was an integral part of how the king maintained his distinct place in the world. In Viking culture, authority wasn't something that could simply be inherited. It had to be earned and continually reaffirmed. The king's separate bed served as a reminder of this responsibility. The separation marked him as a figure, a part, someone who needed solitude to restore himself in order to lead effectively. It also reinforced the idea that leadership required sacrifice. A king who slept apart from the people he ruled showed that his role transcended normal human desires. His need for solitude wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity to ensure that his focus and clarity remained intact for the challenges of leadership. At the same time, this separation also highlighted the unique relationship between the king and his people. The Viking king was not a distant figure who ruled from afar, but rather someone who was deeply connected to the land, to the gods, and to the people. The separate bed was not about creating distance between the king and his subjects. It was about maintaining the mental, spiritual, and physical fortitude necessary to serve those subjects in the best way possible. The separation of his bed symbolized the king's higher calling, but it also spoke to the unity and bond between the king and his warriors. After all, a well-rested king is a strong and capable leader, able to guide his people through the most difficult of times. This practice of keeping the king apart from others was also symbolic of the king's sacred role as a protector. In Viking society, a king wasn't just someone who ruled, he was seen as the shield of his people. His role as protector extended beyond the battlefield. It encompassed every aspect of life, including his sleep. The king's bed was not just a place to rest, it was a space where he could find peace and strength, both physically and spiritually. In this way, the king's separate bed reinforced the idea that his well-being was of the utmost importance. It was not just the king's ability to fight that mattered, but his ability to lead and protect his people. Think about the contrast between the Viking king's lifestyle and the lives of his warriors. While the king had a private, sacred space in which to rest and recuperate, the warriors who fought for him had to endure the hardships of life, on the road often sleeping in tents under the stars or in crowded halls. The king's separate bed was a marker of his elevated status and his divine connection. The warriors, though vital to the kingdom's survival, were not afforded the same luxury. The king's bed, then, was a reflection of the hierarchy that governed Viking society, where kings were at the top, serving as both leaders and protectors, and warriors fought to uphold that order. Historians still debate whether the king's bed was truly a luxury or a necessary component of his role. Some argue that it was a matter of practicality. After all, a king who didn't get the proper rest would be of little use to his people. Others believe it was more symbolic a way for the king to demonstrate his divine right and leadership. Regardless of the reasoning, the king's separate bed remains a unique aspect of Viking leadership that set him apart from the rest of society. The king's bed was a sacred space, not just for him but for his people. It symbolized his role as the protector and leader of the kingdom, someone who needed solitude and rest to be at his best. This separation reinforced the Viking view that a king wasn't just a political leader, but a divine figure set apart from others to fulfill a higher purpose. It was a practice that spoke to the strength, resilience, and discipline required of a Viking king, and a reminder that leadership was never easy, even when it came to something as simple as sleep. As the Viking kingdoms continued to evolve and expand, the idea of the king's separate bed gradually faded, particularly as new forms of leadership and governance began to emerge. The Viking era, with its tightly knit warrior culture, was eventually replaced by more centralized bureaucratic monarchies. The once sacred separation between the king and his people, symbolized by his solitary bed, no longer had the same relevance in a world that was becoming more complex and interconnected. Yet the practice and its meaning continue to hold a certain allure for historians and those curious about Viking society. The decline of the Viking way of life came with the rise of more organized states, the advent of Christianity, and the centralization of power in the hands of monarchs, who no longer needed to maintain the same physical and spiritual boundaries. As the Viking kings adopted Christian customs, many of the practices that marked them as distinct from their subjects, including the practice of sleeping separately, were gradually phased out. In the Christian world, the concept of separation, especially between the king and queen, didn't have the same cultural or spiritual significance as it did in the pre-Christian Viking world. The shift in spiritual beliefs and political structures led to the blending of these practices with the more communal lifestyles of the medieval European courts. Historians argue whether this shift was a sign of progress or a loss of an essential Viking identity. Some suggest that the more open, centralized forms of governance that followed the Viking era helped strengthen the kingdoms and facilitate trade diplomacy and cultural exchange. Others feel that the sacredness of the separate bed, symbolizing the divine connection between the king and the gods, was a loss, an erosion of the Viking understanding of leadership as something distinct, spiritual, and solitary. Regardless of these perspectives, the legacy of the separate bed continues to be a fascinating glimpse into how the Vikings viewed their kings and leadership. Even as the practice faded, the legacy of Viking kingship and their role as spiritual and military leaders influenced future generations. The practice of maintaining some form of separation, whether in the king's bed or in his role as a divine figure, can still be seen in the traditions of monarchs and rulers throughout history. The idea that the leader, particularly the king, is set apart from the ordinary world continues to echo in the concept of royal dignity and the importance of the leader's mental and spiritual well-being. The king's separate bed, though no longer in practice, remains a powerful symbol of the Viking worldview, where leadership, divinity, and personal space intertwined to create a powerful figurehead who could lead his people through even the darkest times. Now, as you imagine the Viking king's life, consider how this small but significant practice, the simple act of sleeping in solitude, fueled the broader legacy of Viking kingship. The king's bed wasn't just a physical space, it was an embodiment of the king's authority and connection to the divine. It was a space for renewal, reflection, and the solitude needed to maintain the clarity and focus required to lead. It was also a space of sacredness where the king could in peace commune with the gods before facing the challenges of his kingdom. This ritualistic sleep, carried out in private, ensured the king's preparedness for the physical and mental demands of leadership. In a way, the separate bed was a symbol of Viking kingship in its purest form. It wasn't about indulgence or luxury. It was about maintaining focused spirituality and the personal strength needed to lead an entire kingdom through uncertain and dangerous times. It was a reflection of the sacred bond between the king and the gods, a bond that was never to be broken, even in the quiet moments of sleep. As the Viking world evolved, so too did the perception of kingship. The shift away from the separate bed marked not just a change in royal customs, but also a transformation in how leadership was understood and practiced. With the rise of Christianity and the increasing influence of more centralized European kingdoms, Viking kings began to adapt their roles to fit within a broader, more structured political landscape. No longer were kings expected to maintain such strict separations between themselves and the rest of society. Instead, a new form of kingship emerged, one where the ruler's power was still divinely ordained, but no longer so strictly confined to a solitary sacred space. But even as these practices evolved, the legacy of the Viking kings remained. Their deep connection to their people, their ability to lead both in battle and peace, and their spiritual role in Viking society, all left a lasting imprint on the way leadership was conceptualized in later monarchies. The concept of a leader as a representative of the divine, someone who could commune with the gods through rituals and solitary rest, continued to resonate in later European royalty. It was as though the idea of separation, that the king's personal space was sacred, couldn't entirely be abandoned. Even in modern times, we still see traces of this idea in the ways leaders are often treated as figures apart from the ordinary people they rule. The shift from the separate bed was not a simple one. It wasn't just about changing habits, it was a reflection of a larger societal transformation. The rise of feudalism, the development of larger empires, and the growing complexity of European politics meant that the isolated warrior-king model could no longer stand on its own. Kings were now more likely to engage in diplomacy, to attend councils, and to rule over much larger territories than ever before. The idea of a solitary spiritual leader who could maintain his clarity and strength through rest, symbolized by his separate bed, no longer fit the needs of the time. Despite this, we can still see echoes of the Viking king's separate bed in the rituals and practices of modern royalty. Though kings and queens today share beds as symbols of unity and togetherness, the concept of the king as a solitary divine figure, set apart from others, continues to influence how we view leadership. Royalty still maintains a certain degree of separation, whether in the form of their palaces, their titles, or their public personas. The separation of the king's bed, while no longer practiced in the same way, still serves as a reminder of the deep cultural roots that shaped leadership in Viking society. As we look back at the Viking king's separate bed, it's fascinating to consider how this seemingly small practice shaped the larger cultural landscape of leadership. It wasn't just about sleep, it was about creating space for the king to maintain his divine connection, his strength, and his authority. The bed was a sanctuary, a place for mental and spiritual restoration, ensuring that the king could lead effectively and remain focused on his sacred duty. The quiet moments of sleep taken in solitude were just as vital to his role as any battle or strategic decision. The bed in this context became a symbol of what it meant to be a Viking king, a warrior, a leader, and a figure of divine strength. Historians continue to explore whether these practices were driven by necessity or by spirituality. Was the king's separate bed a practical need for solitude and rest, or was it a symbolic act reinforcing the idea that the king was not just a ruler, but a divinely appointed protector? Either way, the practice of separate beds left a significant mark on the Viking kingship, a legacy that would resonate in the understanding of leadership long after the Viking age had ended. In the end, the Viking king's bed, though simple, solitary, and perhaps even odd by today's standards, was one of the cornerstones of his leadership. It was a reminder that the king was more than just a leader. He was a symbol of power, spiritual connection, and authority. His separate bed was a place where he could be at his best, ready to face the challenges of ruling a kingdom, guiding his people, and protecting them from the storms of the world. Even in sleep, the Viking king was never truly apart from his people. His rest was a vital part of his leadership, ensuring that he would be able to lead effectively the next day with clarity, strength, and divine favour. As we move further into the exploration of the Viking king's separate bed, it becomes evident that this practice was not just about physical rest or spiritual rituals. It was an embodiment of the Viking worldview. Vikings believed in the balance of opposites, in the tension between chaos and order, between the divine and the mortal. The king's bed, separate from the rest of his kingdom, was a physical manifestation of this balance. It allowed him the solitude necessary to recharge and prepare for the chaotic world of war, politics, and leadership he faced each day. But it was also a sacred space where the king could connect to the divine, reinforcing the idea that the king wasn't just a mortal man, but a figure touched by the gods. In Viking culture, the king was expected to carry out multiple roles. He was a warrior, a strategist, a spiritual guide, and the protector of his people. Each of these roles demanded that the king be at his best physically and mentally. The separation of the king's bed ensured that he had the space and solitude to maintain the clarity and strength necessary to meet the demands of his position. When the king slept, it wasn't just about rest, it was about reinforcing his connection to the divine forces that guided his leadership. But the concept of separate beds for the king wasn't an isolated practice. It was part of a larger Viking ethos that valued individual strength and responsibility. Vikings were by nature solitary creatures. They thrived on personal strength, courage, and self-discipline. This cultural value was reflected in the king's bed, which symbolised the king's personal connection to his divine purpose and his role as the leader of his people. The bed was not just for sleep, it was a space for the king to find clarity, reconnect with his divine mission, and prepare himself for the challenges of leadership. Imagine the king lying in his bed alone with his thoughts, perhaps even dreaming of the next battle or the next conquest. In this moment of solitude, he wasn't just resting his body, he was mentally preparing for the trials of his role. This time allowed the king to process his thoughts, reflect on the decisions he made, and centre himself for the challenges ahead. Whether he prayed to the gods, meditated, or simply thought quietly to himself, the time in his separate bed was crucial to his ability to lead his kingdom effectively. And it wasn't just the king who recognised the importance of this space. His warriors, his advisors, and his people knew that the king's well-being was tied to his leadership. A tired, distracted king would not make the best decisions. His ability to lead his people depended on his mental clarity, focus, and strength. By ensuring that the king had the space to rest and recharge, Viking society ensured that their leader would always be at his best. The separate bed also helped maintain a sense of respect for the king's status. In a world where the king's authority was often questioned, whether by rival kings, warriors, or even his own people, the king's bed reinforced his role as the ultimate leader. He wasn't just another warrior, he was a figure of divine authority. The separate bed, with its solitude and spiritual significance, served as a reminder that the king's role was not just a matter of politics, it was a matter of destiny, a role ordained by the gods. Historians debate whether this practice was driven more by practicality or spirituality. Was the separate bed a pragmatic necessity, ensuring that the king was well rested and able to face the challenges of leadership? Or was it a deeply spiritual practice, reinforcing the king's connection to the divine? Some scholars believe it was a bit of both. The king's separate bed allowed him the solitude and rest needed to lead effectively, but it also served as a sacred space, helping him to maintain his divine connection. Either way, it's clear that the practice of separate beds played an essential role in the Viking king's leadership, ensuring that he was always physically and mentally prepared to lead his people. As we continue to reflect on the Viking king's separate bed, it's important to consider the broader cultural context and how this practice shaped the way the Vikings saw authority, leadership, and divinity. In many ways, the king's bed was a reflection of the social structure of Viking society. It reinforced the idea that the king, while a leader among men, was still set apart a figure who had to be physically, mentally, and spiritually prepared to rule. This separation wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a statement of purpose. The king's bed was a tool to help him maintain his connection to his people and the gods. Viking kings didn't rule by decree alone. They ruled by example, by strength, and by wisdom. Their ability to lead was tied to their character, and the practices surrounding their sleep helped ensure that their character remained steadfast. In a world that was constantly in flux, where danger and chaos loomed around every corner, the king needed a space where he could focus on his duties without distraction. The separate bed served as a form of self-discipline, allowing the king to preserve his strength and clarity of mind, ensuring that he could lead his people through both calm and storm. Moreover, this practice reflected the larger Viking view of kingship as a sacred responsibility. Viking kings were seen as divinely chosen, appointed by the gods to protect their people and lead them to victory. Their separate beds were part of that divine mandate. By sleeping alone, the king maintained his connection to the divine, ensuring that his leadership remained in alignment with the gods' will. It was a practice that acknowledged the king's sacred duty to not only lead his people, but to uphold the spiritual balance of the world around him. Imagine the king waking in the morning having spent a night alone in his bed. His rest has restored him, prepared him for the day ahead. As he rises, he is not just a man, he is a king, a representative of the gods, a figure whose decisions will shape the fate of his people. The quiet solitude of his bed has allowed him to reflect on his responsibilities, and now, with renewed focus and clarity, he is ready to face the challenges of the day. This ritualistic separation from the world allows him to step back into the fray with the strength and wisdom needed to lead. But as Viking society evolved, so too did the role of the king. The demands of leadership became more complex, and the once solitary rituals of kingship began to give way to more communal practices. As the Viking world transitioned to more centralized forms of governance, the king's separate bed gradually lost its spiritual and practical significance. The rise of Christianity and the expansion of kingdoms led to new forms of leadership, where kings were expected to rule over larger territories, engage in diplomacy, and adopt new practices that were more in line with the changing world. While the practice of the separate bed faded, the underlying values that it represented did not. The idea that a leader must maintain physical and mental strength, that his rest is essential for his ability to lead, continue to influence the way kings ruled in the centuries to come. Even today, we see echoes of this tradition in the way leaders and monarchs are expected to maintain their health, their focus, and their authority. The king's separate bed, though no longer practiced, was a precursor to the understanding that leadership requires more than just strength. It requires preparation, solitude, and clarity. And in a way, the king's bed still exists today, albeit in a different form. It's no longer a literal space where kings retreat to recharge. Instead, it's the mental and emotional space that today's leaders create for themselves. It's about having time to reflect, to plan, and to prepare for the challenges ahead. The separate bed was a physical manifestation of this need for space, for solitude, and for mental clarity. It was a practice that acknowledged that great leadership requires more than just action. It requires rest, introspection, and the time to focus on the larger picture. As we come to the end of our journey through the Viking king's separate bed, it's clear that this seemingly simple practice was so much more than a mere quirk of ancient kingship. It was a profound symbol of leadership, spiritual connection, and personal responsibility. The bed, the ritual surrounding it, and the king's solitude within it were all integral to how Viking society functioned. It wasn't just about rest, it was about creating a space where the king could connect with the divine, maintain his focus, and prepare for the monumental tasks of leading a kingdom. In a world filled with constant threats and challenges, that mental and spiritual preparation was as essential as physical strength. The Viking king's separate bed was not just a personal ritual, it was a reflection of his role in the larger cosmic order. It reinforced the idea that leadership was not a simple task of governing. It was a divine calling, requiring strength, clarity, and spiritual discipline. The solitude of the king's bed was a place where he could maintain the mental fortitude necessary to rule effectively, ensuring that his leadership remained in alignment with the gods and with the needs of his people. It was a space for restoration, both physical and spiritual, and it helped prepare the king for the intense responsibilities he would face each day. As we look back on this fascinating custom, we begin to understand that the king's separate bed wasn't just about the king at all, it was about the kingdom. It was a space that allowed him to lead with strength and focus, and in doing so, he ensured that his people were protected and that the kingdom would thrive. The separate bed was a powerful tool for ensuring that the king's leadership was always at its best, and it became an enduring symbol of the careful balance between divine right, personal responsibility, and the physical and spiritual well-being required to rule. In a sense, the Viking king's bed, though now a practice of the past, still carries a lesson for us today. We may no longer have kings who sleep alone in their chambers, but we can still learn from their example. The idea that leaders need time for rest, reflection, and solitude is still relevant in our fast-paced, hyper-connected world. Whether it's the head of a family, a business executive, or a leader of a nation, the need for mental clarity and spiritual grounding remains vital. The king's separate bed wasn't just about leadership in the past, it's a reminder that in all aspects of life, we need time to recharge and reconnect with our purpose. And so as we end this story, take a moment to reflect on the legacy of the Viking king and his bed. His separate bed was a sacred space that allowed him to lead with wisdom and strength. It was a reminder that leadership, whether in the Viking age or today, requires balance, solitude, and clarity of mind. Just as the Viking king separated himself from the rest of the world for a time of rest and reflection, so too can we find moments of quiet in our own busy lives to recharge and connect with our purpose. Now, as you close your eyes and let the quiet of the night settle in around you, think of that Viking king alone in his bed, preparing for the challenges ahead. His bed may have been solitary, but it served a greater purpose to ensure that his mind, body, and spirit were ready to lead with strength and wisdom. And perhaps in your own quiet moments, you can find a similar space for reflection and renewal, just like the Viking kings of old.